Sometimes studios well and truly need to learn to let go of a franchise when there's nothing else to be said and done, and that's how I currently feel about the Lord of the Rings franchise in the hands of Warner Brothers. Historically, I love the Jackson vs. Tolkien films. I was just a kid when the original trilogy was coming out, and they were like nothing I'd ever seen before, and they well and truly kickstarted my long love of fantasy works. It helped that they were also just some of the most incredibly made films. Seriously, if you ever have some spare time, just try to find on YouTube the appendices from the extended editions of the films to really showcase how much love and care was put into making these movies. It cost hundreds of millions of dollars to make them. They grossed almost $3 billion at the box office, and then they got Oscar wins as well. A job well done. And even now it's held up as the gold standard of fantasy filmmaking, alongside the likes of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe from the 2005 version. Just some incredibly made movies. Of course, in the wake of that success, people started clamoring for The Hobbit to be made as well, and of course eventually this dream became a reality. However, in the end, it wasn't quite the same, was it? Don't get me wrong, it was still very good in a lot of ways, but at the same time, it was clear to everybody they jumped the gun in turning it into a trilogy when it should have been 2 films. I will say that before we go any further that of course I am talking about this from a quality perspective. The films just weren't as good, and it very much felt drawn out when it could have been more concise. That being said, it clearly paid off at the box office because the films ended up grossing close to $3 billion together, much like the original trilogy. From that point of view, I think it does work. However, I never really had much of a hankering to sit down and watch the Hobbit trilogy in the same way that I did the Lord of the Rings. It felt less handcrafted, less inspired, it felt very CGI heavy, and all around less fun. Don't get me wrong, they weren't necessarily bad or anything like that, but just a pale shadow of what the Lord of the Rings was. However, with the end of that trilogy, I kind of figured that this would be the end of the film franchise for good. Of course, that is now known to not be the case. I guess they needed to make more films to retain the rights or something. The first of these came last year with the release of the animated film The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. I made a video about that when it came out, so I won't dive too much into it, but the reality is that the film just wasn't very good. Had a very weak plot that relied far too much on nostalgia to try to sell it, and pretty poor characterization overall. It just didn't feel like a Middle-earth film, to tell you the truth. It felt like discount Studio Ghibli. It was also a massive flop at the box office. I don't know what they were thinking with this one, to tell you the truth. However, that being said, it is not the only Middle-earth film they have in the works. No, apparently we have 2 more concepts that are coming to the screen at some point in the future, with the classic producers being brought back, including Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyens doing screenplays. I don't think we know what both of these films are going to be about, but we do know what the first one is, and that is The Hunt for Gollum, which is set to release on the 17th of December 2027, and will be directed by Andy Serkis, who of course is Gollum. Now don't get me wrong, I don't like to be a hater or anything like that, but surely we gotta let this franchise die. Or at least pivot in a different direction, for the love of God. Why would anybody care about this film? For those that are not well versed in the lore of Middle-earth, the story of The Hunt for Gollum will be something along these lines. Gandalf believes the One Ring is in the Shire, and that it's the very same ring that Bilbo left behind. He decides the only thing for it is to hunt down the creature that Bilbo spoke about when he first found the ring in the first place, as that could give him a better idea as to the origin of the ring. Thus, he and Aragorn go on the hunt for Gollum, but their trail goes cold because he's been imprisoned in Mordor, and he gets tortured for information by Sauron himself. Eventually, he gets let free and will be caught by Aragorn near the Dead Marshes, which is where Gandalf re-enters the picture. Aragorn would notify him of having found Gollum at long last, and thus Gandalf can interrogate him about the ring. This all happens shortly after he's read about the Ring of Power from the account of Isildur that we see in the movie, where he's sifting through all those scrolls. Gandalf learns from Gollum the story of how he found the ring, and then he learns that Sauron also wanted to know the same information, and who has it now. Knowing that Sauron's on the trail of the ring, Gandalf is now pretty certain it's the one, and that's enough to send him back to the Shire to get Frodo out of there, and kickstart the quest that will bring about the destruction of the ring and the final defeat of Sauron. There. That is quite literally the story. It is a storyline that is so small and insignificant that the book covers it in the appendices and in a bit of exposition by Gandalf when he's in the Shire with Frodo. Meanwhile, in the movies, they cover it in 2 scenes. The one where Gandalf goes to Minas Tirith to read the scroll of Isildur and learn about the Ring of Power, and then the other where there's a short clip of Gollum being tortured by Sauron's orcs in Mordor for information, and Gandalf saying he tried to find him. That is the full story that we deal with here. It is a fairly short narrative, all things considered, even if it takes place over a longer period of time, simply because nothing happens in that time. It's the same reason the films heavily condense how long Frodo has the ring compared to the book, because nothing much happens, and it would continue to stretch the film's opening beyond what is necessary for a screen adaptation. Thus, I don't see how you could get a compelling narrative out of what they have. I have a sneaking suspicion it's going to be a lot of Gollum flashbacks, which is not something I'm terribly interested in, to tell you the truth. Don't get me wrong, Gollum is an interesting enough character. More than interesting. He was great. However, we've seen all we need to see from him, haven't we? We saw his origin in Return of the King and how he found the ring. He murdered his cousin for it, and then he turned into the creepy crawler we see in the movies. In The Hobbit, we see how Bilbo got the ring from him, and during the course of the Two Towers, it seems like there is a chance that he could be somehow redeemed, and even starts to somewhat reform before in the end it all comes crumbling back down. His dark side returns with a vengeance, and he plots the betrayal of the hobbits, and his determination to get the ring only increases. We see it all, the failed redemption arc, his origin, the origin of Bilbo's time with the ring, so I guess that just makes me question what else you can really do with his character. There's nothing else to be showcased, nothing new to be revealed. It just seems like a very silly plot thread to tug on if you ask me. It feels like a narrative dead end where everything is simply spinning its wheels. I think the only character you can get much out of from any value would be Aragorn. But even then, you're wasting potential backstory and narrative on this no-hoper movie when Aragorn's character could very easily anchor his own movie or series of movies. Because that's just a whole different gripe I have here. Why in the world are they making this movie? A weird prelude to The Lord of the Rings that'll be a complete nothing burger when they could actually just make something far more interesting, that's touched on in the appendices and thus is fair game to adapt, but that could also help to flesh out their cinematic universe. I'm not saying they need to let go of everything to do with the original franchise and let it fade away, but my god, they need to rest the story of the ring. That is essential. Everything relevant there is over and done with. Same with Gollum. Gandalf and Aragorn, yes, they have more story potential, that is true. It just isn't here. Gandalf himself has heaps of concepts you could explore. I mean, the dude is supposed to have travelled all over for thousands of years if you look at the lore. You could slap Gandalf into any original story of expanded works based on the appendices, and it would work well. However, that's not even what I think would make the best idea for a story or a film. I think if they want to keep the connections to the mainline movies and the Fellowship and Mordor, etc., they should do the story of young Aragorn, right? I mean, pretty much the entirety of that storyline is within the appendices. Here it is. Aragorn is the only son of Arathorn, the chieftain of the Dunedain. He's the leader of the Rangers of the North. When he's a little kid, his dad gets killed by orcs because, orcs are dangerous and there aren't enough people in the North to keep them in check. Plus, being of the line of Isildur is a tough job, no doubt about it. Sauron is in a perpetual state of wanting you dead. He goes and lives in Rivendell where he's raised by his mum and Elrond. When he comes of age, he's told the full truth of who he is and he promptly falls in love with Arwen when he meets her, but she's older and wiser and thinks of him as a youngster still. Ouch, but he rolls with it. Already, I think this is a pretty interesting sort of prologue to a story. You have a dynamic that we don't get to see much of in the films with fatherly Elrond and his foster son. You get to meet Aragorn's mother and see what an impact she had on his life. In the lore, apparently she's completely opposed to the idea of him wanting to marry Arwen to begin with, which is interesting to me. The wiki says that she thought Arwen's lineage was way too noble for Aragorn, way above his breeding. I know in the book he is a bit more self-assured about who he is and what he deserves, but in the movie, it's clear he thinks his lineage sucks, and you could play into that with this sort of thing. On top of that, seeing him get rebuffed romantically by Arwen, it would be pretty funny, not gonna lie. Especially since in the end it all works out and how lovey-dovey they behave within the movies. Like I said though, that's just all character build. That's just the introductory section. That's like the actual prologue of the movies where you see the elves and men versus Sauron, and then you have that introductory stuff in the Shire and then the adventure to Rivendell before the Fellowship actually properly forms. After this, you come to what could make a great film or series of films following Aragorn as your main protagonist, where he slowly develops into the character you see in the Fellowship of the Ring and beyond. Taking up a pseudonym, he went out to serve the great lords of this time. First he goes to Rohan to ride alongside Thengel, the king of Rohan, and the father of Theoden. This is actually referenced in the Two Towers movie at one point when they're talking about how Aragorn is quite old by the time of the War of the Ring. I don't think they go into much depth about what actually happens during this time, but there is a lot of potential here. You can have Aragorn helping fight the Rohirrim against the orcs or the wild men, plus you can have him bond with the young Prince Theoden. I think that'd be a lot of fun. Already that's a movie in and of itself, I think, and then you can move along. Next he goes to Gondor where he serves in the court of Ecthelion, who is the ruling steward and the father of Denethor that we know from the series. Thus he's also the granddad of Boromir and Faramir. Already this has given us a lot to work with, right? Apparently he was a beloved figure in Gondor at this time, especially by Ecthelion, but he wasn't liked by Denethor, who knew who he was and was jealous of his father's attentions. It would add some extra emotion behind Denethor's disdain towards accepting his claim in Return of the King, and even though Boromir would only be a young child, it would still be fun to see that. He eventually fights the Corsairs, the dudes with the ships from Return of the King, he beats their asses, and off he goes on more adventures to lands that Tolkien never really wrote much about in the South and the East. This is where you could take some more creative liberties if you wanted to. Before he comes back to Lothlorien, he meets Arwen again, she falls in love with him at long last. And there you have it. I think that's a great premise for a storyline, to tell you the truth. It has links to the trilogy, it involves a nostalgic character but still does something fresh and interesting and could show new things. I'd be all for it. But back to the idea of the hunt for Gollum. My god, I hope they don't trot out any of the actors from the originals at this point. Surely it's too late. Gandalf will obviously feature in the movie, but Ian McKellen is 86 years old now. He was god tier in Lord of the Rings. He'd clearly aged by the time they were working on The Hobbit, and now he would be way more elderly. even when he's rather youthful in The Lord of the Rings, which is meant to take place at the exact same time. 1, it would just be kind of sad to see this, but 2, it would mess with the continuity quite a lot and just wouldn't feel right. Same for if they trot out Elijah Wood, who's now past 40, to play Frodo when he'd be way more aged here compared to his more youthful appearance. It would be like when they had Orlando Bloom come back for The Hobbit. It just didn't look right since his original trilogy, Legolas, looked so young comparatively. Also, trotting out Viggo Mortensen would be such a mistake too. I don't think he would come back anyway, but trying to recapture the pure, undiluted glory of peak Viggo as Aragorn with the almost 70-year-old version of him now, that would just be sad, I think. Just recast, for the love of God. I know people are nostalgic, but like I said, you need to know when to let go. In the end, this project just fills me with dread. I really wish they were making something else. I hope the screenplay is better than the War of the Rohirrim, but I'm just so nervous that they'll have nothing to work with. This should not have been greenlit. Of course, though, in the end, these are just my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the idea of The Hunt for Gollum? Do you think it has any chance of being good? Or are you more cynical like me on this one? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.